He threw his black credit card on the table and smirked. "I'll give you $200,000 if you can serve me in Japanese." The restaurant went silent. Everyone stared at the young black waitress, expecting her to crumble. But when she finally opened her mouth, what came out made the billionaire's jaw drop and changed his life forever. Richard Holt was one of those men who believed money could buy anything: respect, loyalty, even humiliation. The 48-year-old billionaire had built an empire from ruthless business deals, but he had also built a reputation for playing cruel games with people he considered beneath him. Tonight, he wasn't just here for dinner. He was here to entertain himself. The restaurant, Orem, glowed like a palace: gold chandeliers, soft jazz, and the scent of truffle butter hanging in the air. Every waiter and chef in the building knew that when Richard Holt booked a table, someone's pride would be tested. And when Amara walked in for her night shift, she had no idea she would become his next target. Amara moved with quiet grace, balancing trays like she'd done this her whole life. She'd learned to smile even when customers were rude, to bow even when they mocked her accent. But behind that calm smile, there lived a story no one in that restaurant could imagine. A story of survival, brilliance, and resilience. "Who's serving Mr. Holt tonight?" the manager whispered nervously. When Amara stepped forward, the manager hesitated. "Are you sure? He's difficult." "I'll be fine," she said softly. When she approached Richard's table, he didn't look up from his phone. "Bring me the chef's special. And don't take too long." "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her tone polite and even. Minutes later, she returned with his order: Wagyu steak, perfectly seared. As she placed it before him, he finally looked at her. His eyes scanned her name tag, his lips curling with that familiar arrogance. "Amara," he said slowly, as if tasting the word. "Where are you from?" "Chicago, sir." He smiled, a cruel kind of smile. "No, I mean really from." Her polite expression didn't waver. "My family's from Ghana." "Ah," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Ghana. Beautiful country. I've never been, of course. But I imagine the service there isn't quite like this." A few guests nearby chuckled awkwardly. Amara just nodded. "Would you like anything else, sir?" Richard's smirk widened. "Yes. I'd like to make this dinner more interesting. I'll give you $200,000 if you serve me in Japanese." The sound of forks and glasses stopped. Even the pianist at the corner froze mid-note. Everyone turned to watch. A few whispered among themselves. "Did he just say 200,000? She can't do it, can she?" Richard loved this. The power, the attention, the feeling of dominance. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Come on. 200 grand. Just one sentence. Let's see if you can impress me." Amara stood still, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "Omates ita shimashita. Gachaman wa ikigashimasuka, sensei." "Thank you for waiting, sir. How would you like your meal served?" The words were perfect, the pronunciation crisp, the tone respectful, the fluency undeniable. The entire restaurant fell silent. Richard blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Amara continued, her voice graceful, confident. "Kono gyuniku wa tokabetsu na wagyu disu. Tano ryuri imo osasum shimasu." This beef is special wagyu. I also recommend the other dishes. Someone in the corner gasped. "Wait, that's real Japanese." "She's fluent." Richard froze. His smirk faded. "You speak Japanese?" "Yes, sir," Amara replied, bowing slightly. "And 8 other languages." The shock hit the room like thunder. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. It was electric. Even the manager's jaw dropped. Richard tried to hide his embarrassment behind a laugh. 9 languages? You're joking." Amara smiled faintly. "I never joke about hard work, sir." He stared at her, stunned. The girl he thought he could humiliate had just humiliated him, effortlessly. "So what's next?" she asked calmly. "Would you like your dessert in French, or should I describe the wine in Italian?" The audience around them chuckled softly, sensing the shift in power. The mighty billionaire was speechless. For the first time that night, Richard felt something strange: respect, and maybe a sting of guilt. He leaned forward, voice lower now. "Where did you learn all that?" Amara smiled, the kind of smile that carried pain and pride together. "From the people who never thought I could." The words hit him harder than any insult could. He sat back, studying her, the waitress who just dismantled his arrogance with a few elegant words. Something about her intrigued him deeply, more than he wanted to admit. But Richard Holt wasn't a man who gave up easily. And as the night went on, he decided he wasn't done with Amara yet. He didn't know it then, but this small act, this moment of humiliation, would lead to a story the world would never forget. After that moment, the restaurant never returned to its usual calm. Whispers rippled from table to table. Everyone was talking about the black waitress who'd just spoken Japanese better than any native they'd ever heard. But Amara didn't seem affected. She continued serving other customers, quiet and graceful, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Richard Holt, however, couldn't stop watching her. His mind, usually filled with numbers, deals, and luxury, now played back her words again and again. That calm voice, that flawless accent, that unshakable composure. Who was she? He called the manager over. That waitress, Amara. How long has she worked here? About 8 months, sir, the manager stammered. She's one of our best. Always polite, never late. Doesn't talk much. Background. The manager hesitated. We don't know much, sir. She just walked in one day asking for a job. Said she needed something steady. Richard nodded slowly, his curiosity deepening. As Amara cleared his table, he said, You didn't tell me you were a linguist. She smiled faintly. You didn't ask, sir. Touché, he said under his breath. Where did you learn Japanese? In Japan, she said simply. He raised an eyebrow. You live there? Yes. For 3 years. He frowned. Doing what? Amara placed his empty wine glass on the tray. Teaching English. And washing dishes when the pay wasn't enough. Richard studied her, the way she said it without bitterness, just honesty. And the other 8 languages? She met his gaze for the first time. One for every job I've ever had. Her answer struck him silent. When he left that night, Richard couldn't shake off the image of her bowing politely while the rest of the room stared in awe. She'd faced his arrogance with elegance and won. The next evening, Richard returned. The staff whispered in surprise. Billionaires like him didn't visit the same restaurant twice in a row. But he had a reason. When Amara approached his table, he said, I suppose you'll expect another challenge tonight. Amara smiled. I don't expect anything, sir. I just serve. He gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. She blinked. Sir. I said sit. Consider it a conversation, not a command. The other waiters exchanged nervous glances, but Amara slowly sat down. Richard leaned forward. You fascinate me, Amara. I've met CEOs, models, scientists, but none of them could shut me up the way you did last night. I didn't mean to embarrass you, she said softly. He chuckled. Oh, you did. But I deserved it. For the first time, his voice carried something unfamiliar, sincerity. He looked at her hands. 9 languages. That's impressive. What's the story behind that? Amara exhaled, her eyes softening. I was born in Chicago. My parents worked in a small store. When I was 12, my father died, and my mother couldn't afford my school anymore. I started cleaning houses. Some of the families I worked for spoke French, others Arabic, some Spanish. I listened. I learned. Richard was silent. When I turned 18, she continued, I applied for a scholarship program in Japan, but I was rejected because they didn't believe someone like me could qualify. So I worked as a maid in a language school there instead. I cleaned their floors during the day and studied from their trash at night. Torn books, scribbled notes, old CDs. Richard blinked. You learn languages from garbage? Amara smiled. Knowledge doesn't care where it comes from, sir. He stared at her, speechless. For once, the billionaire who always had a witty reply had none. She stood up politely. I should get back to work. Enjoy your meal. As she walked away, Richard felt something shift inside him, something unsettling. He'd built his empire by believing people like Amara were just background extras in his story. But tonight, he realized he might be a side character in hers. Over the next few weeks, Richard returned again and again. Each time, he asked for her section. Each time, he tried to learn more. He found out she volunteered at a children's center on weekends, teaching immigrant kids how to read. That she lived in a small one-room apartment, but spent half her earnings sending money to her younger sister in college. She never complained, never bragged, just worked, quietly, gracefully, like a melody no one noticed until it stopped. One night, as the restaurant began to close, Richard stayed behind. He waited until the last guest left, then called her over. Do you ever regret not chasing something bigger? He asked. Amara thought for a moment. Bigger than what, sir? Than this, he said, gesturing around. Serving tables. You could be doing something incredible with your talent. She smiled softly. Sometimes, sir, you have to start where you are. I used to think success meant standing on top of the world. Now I think it's about standing tall, no matter where you are. Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. The next day, Richard made a phone call to a private investigator. Find everything you can about Amara. He didn't know why he needed to know. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe guilt, maybe both. But what he discovered the following week would shake him more than he could have imagined. Amara wasn't just a waitress who'd worked abroad. She was once a translator for a Japanese government research institute, one of the youngest they'd ever hired. Her name was on academic papers. She'd been invited to conferences. Until one day, she vanished from public records completely. The investigators sent a report. She left Japan after a scandal involving her supervisor. Someone tried to take credit for her work. She resigned quietly and never fought back. Richard stared at the file in disbelief. The woman he'd mocked for being a waitress had once been one of the brightest minds in her field, and she'd given it all up for silence. That night, he returned to the restaurant once more. When Amara came to his table, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, truly looked. You could have exposed them, he said finally. Why didn't you? Amara's eyes darkened for the first time. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be lived. He felt something heavy rise in his chest. Shame, respect, admiration. Maybe all three. But before he could reply, a camera flash went off near the bar. Someone was filming. Isn't that Richard Holt talking to a waitress again? A voice whispered. He turned sharply, but it was too late. Tomorrow, the world would see those photos. And everything would change. By the next morning, Richard Holt's name was trending everywhere. The headlines were merciless. Billionaire seen dining repeatedly with waitress. Secret affair? Mystery woman captures billionaire's attention. Who is she? News outlets replayed the same grainy photos. Richard sitting across from Amara, her face half lit by candlelight, smiling faintly as she poured his wine. The tabloids twisted the story, painting her as a gold digger, a social climber, a woman chasing money. Amara saw it all when she opened her phone that morning before her shift. For a long time, she just stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. The comments were worse than the headlines. She's using him. Typical, playing the sympathy card. She's probably lying about speaking all those languages. By the time she reached the restaurant, photographers were already outside. Flashes went off the moment she entered. The manager pulled her aside. Amara, maybe you should take a few days off. She looked at him, her eyes calm but sad. Because I did my job? He sighed. You know it's not that. It's just the attention. The owner's nervous. Mr. Holt's lawyers called too. They don't want this to look bad. She nodded slowly. Of course. I understand. But inside, her heart ached. Not because of the lies, but because she had finally found peace in her quiet work, and now even that was being taken from her. Meanwhile, across town, Richard sat in his office at the top of the Holt Tower, his phone ringing nonstop. His PR team was in panic mode. Sir, we need to issue a statement immediately, his assistant said. People are speculating. It's damaging your image. Richard threw his pen on the table. I don't care about my image. His assistant blinked. Sir, for once, he said, standing up, I actually care about the truth. That afternoon, without his usual entourage or limousine, Richard drove himself to the restaurant. The paparazzi spotted him within minutes, shouting questions as he entered. Mr. Holt, are you dating the waitress? Is she your mistress? Did you pay her to spend time with you? Richard ignored them all. When he stepped inside, the restaurant fell quiet. Amara was at the counter, quietly folding napkins. When she saw him, her eyes flickered with surprise. Sir, you shouldn't be here right now, she said softly. They'll twist this again. I don't care what they say, Richard replied. You didn't deserve any of it. She hesitated. It's not your fault. He looked at her, really looked, the fatigue in her face, the pain she tried to hide. Maybe not. But I made the first move that started it. I humiliated you, remember? I turned you into a spectacle. And now the world's doing the same. Her lips curved into a sad smile. The world has always been like that, sir. I'm just used to surviving quietly. He shook his head. Not anymore. Not quietly. You deserve better. Amara blinked. Better doesn't come easy for people like me. Then I'll make it easy, he said firmly. Before she could respond, he walked to the center of the restaurant, where several journalists were waiting outside the glass windows. He motioned for them to come in. The manager looked horrified. "Sir, this isn't. Let them in," Richard said. Within moments, cameras and microphones filled the space. The reporters surrounded him, ready to pounce. "Mr. Holt, are you having an affair with this woman?" one asked. Richard turned toward Amara. She stood still, watching him, her expression unreadable. He took a deep breath and said clearly, "No, but I am guilty of underestimating her, and maybe, for the first time in my life, I'm ashamed of who I was." The room went silent. Even the reporters hesitated. He continued, "This woman isn't just a waitress. She's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. She speaks 9 languages, worked in Japan, and gave up a promising career because she refused to let injustice change who she was. I mocked her, and she still treated me with respect." Amara's eyes softened, but she said nothing. Richard looked at the cameras. "You want a story? Here's your story. A billionaire tried to buy dignity with $200,000, and a woman who had nothing reminded him that real worth can't be bought." The flash of cameras filled the room again, but this time, the story had changed. That night, Amara's phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages from strangers, journalists, even universities. People wanted to know her story. They wanted to hear her voice. But Amara didn't respond to any of them. She just sat by her window, watching the rain fall. Later that night, a knock sounded at her apartment door. When she opened it, Richard stood there, holding a small envelope. She frowned slightly. "You shouldn't have come here." He smiled faintly. "I've learned I don't always do what I should." He handed her the envelope. "This isn't money. It's something else." She opened it slowly, a plane ticket. "To Tokyo?" she whispered. Richard nodded. "You said you never got to finish what you started there. There's a university waiting for you now. I made some calls. They're offering you a fellowship, one that recognizes your work." Her eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do this." He shook his head. "I wanted to. I can't erase what I did, Amara. But maybe I can help you stand where you belong. Not behind a table, but in front of one." For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then she said quietly, "You know, in Japanese culture, they say the highest form of apology isn't words, it's action." He smiled softly. "Then let me act." When he left that night, Amara held the ticket to her chest, tears rolling down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But life wasn't finished testing them yet. The next morning, a new headline appeared online. "Billionaire buys plane ticket for Waitress. Charity or guilt trip?" And just like that, the storm began again. The next few days turned into chaos. Every news channel, every gossip blog, every social feed had the same story: the billionaire and the waitress. Is he trying to buy forgiveness? Was the fellowship a publicity stunt? Maybe she's playing along for fame. The world twisted their story into a circus again. Photos of Amara holding the tickets circulated everywhere, her tears misinterpreted as manipulation. Even the university in Japan began receiving emails from critics questioning her integrity. Inside her tiny apartment, Amara sat in silence, staring at the headlines. She'd always believed that dignity was stronger than lies, but the world was proving her wrong. A soft knock echoed at the door. When she opened it, her neighbor handed her a folded newspaper. The front page had her picture under the words, "The Billionaire's Charity Case." That was the breaking point. She packed her small suitcase, turned off her phone, and left a short note under Richard's name. "Thank you for trying to help me, but I can't live as someone else's story." By the time Richard arrived at her apartment that evening, she was gone. He read the note 3 times, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, the man who controlled everything realized there were things money could never fix: trust, pain, reputation. He called his driver. "Get me a ticket to Tokyo. Tonight." The driver hesitated. "Sir, the media," I said tonight. The flight was long and silent. Outside the window, the clouds looked endless, like walls he'd built around himself for years. Walls Amara had somehow cracked with just her dignity. When he landed in Japan, he spent 3 days searching. He checked the university, the small cafes near Shibuya, the language schools, the embassies, but no one had seen her. Until one evening, while walking near the quiet streets of Kyoto, he heard the faint sound of children laughing. Following it, He reached a small community school tucked behind a park. And there, through the open window, he saw her. Amara stood in front of a classroom filled with kids, teaching, smiling, correcting their pronunciation in Japanese. The sight stopped him cold. There she was, no fame, no spotlight, no noise. Just doing what she loved. He waited outside until class ended. When she finally stepped out, she froze at the sight of him. "Richard?" she whispered. He smiled faintly. "You're hard to find." She sighed softly. "You shouldn't have come." He shook his head. "Maybe not. But I had to see you. I had to understand why you'd walk away from everything." Amara looked up at the darkening sky. Because peace isn't built on noise. The world only listens when you're loud. But I've learned that silence can be louder if it's honest. He took a step closer. "And what about me? You didn't even give me a chance to explain." Her eyes softened. "You did more than enough. You stood up for me when you didn't have to. But the world will always see me as a charity case next to you. I can't live that way." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You think I helped you because I pity you?" She didn't answer. Richard exhaled. "Amara, for years I surrounded myself with people who spoke money. You were the first person who spoke truth, in every language. You reminded me who I used to be before the arrogance, before the titles. You didn't just change a night in a restaurant. You changed me." For the first time, Amara's eyes glistened. "Why do you care so much?" He hesitated before answering. "Because for once, I finally met someone I couldn't buy, and I don't want to lose her." Her breath caught. She looked away, her voice trembling. "Richard, our worlds aren't the same." He smiled gently. "Then let me learn your world. You taught me a few words of Japanese that night. Maybe it's time I learn what they really mean." For a long silence, only the sound of wind moved between them. Then Amara said softly, "You don't need to prove anything to me." He shook his head. "I'm not proving it. I'm living it." Over the next few days, Richard stayed in Kyoto, helping at the small school where Amara taught. He cleaned classrooms, fixed old chairs, and even tried to learn basic Japanese greetings, often mispronouncing them, making the kids laugh. One afternoon, as they walked home from class, Amara said quietly, "You don't belong here, Richard." He smiled. "Maybe not. But for the first time, I feel like I do." She looked at him. This man who once humiliated her, now humble enough to bow before children and apologize for his broken Japanese. "People don't change that easily," she whispered. "Maybe not," he replied. "But they can start somewhere." That evening, as they watched the sunset from a small wooden bridge, Amara said softly, "In my language, we have a word, nkiinkium. It means adaptability. It's about bending without breaking." He nodded slowly. "Then that's what you are, Amara. You bend, but you never break." She smiled faintly. "And you, Richard, maybe you're finally learning to listen." For a long time, they stood there in silence. Two worlds, two souls, one lesson. But their peace wouldn't last long. Back in the U.S., the media had caught wind of Richard's sudden disappearance. Reporters discovered his flight to Japan and began speculating again. Billionaire abandons empire for waitress in Japan. Romantic obsession or redemption trip? The headlines went viral overnight. And soon, journalists began arriving in Kyoto, searching for them. When Amara saw the first camera vans parked near the school, her heart sank. "It's happening again," she whispered. Richard clenched his jaw. "Let them talk." "No," she said firmly. "The kids here don't deserve this attention. This was my safe place. And now, because of me, it's in danger." He looked at her helplessly. "What do you want me to do?" She hesitated, then said, "You have the power to end this story, Richard. You started it. Only you can finish it." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. "If you really care about me, walk away." He stared at her in silence, the hardest silence he'd ever faced. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If that's what it takes to give you peace, I'll go." She looked down, tears slipping from her eyes. "Thank you." And just like that, he turned and walked away. As the reporters surrounded him on the street, shouting questions, Richard said only one thing. "There is no story here. Just a lesson I had to learn the hard way." Then he disappeared back into the noise of the city, leaving behind the only person who had ever silenced him with truth. Months passed. The world eventually moved on. Headlines faded. Reporters chased newer scandals, and the internet forgot the story it had once devoured. But for Richard Hale, forgetting wasn't so easy. He returned to New York, But the city no longer felt like his. The tall glass buildings seemed emptier, the meetings more meaningless. His assistants noticed he no longer barked orders or interrupted people mid-sentence. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by something quieter, deeper. He sold 2 of his luxury yachts and donated the money anonymously to fund scholarships for underprivileged language students, in Amara's name. When his business partners asked why, he simply said, "Because brilliance doesn't always wear a suit." Every night, he'd find himself standing by his penthouse window, staring at the skyline, hearing echoes of her voice in his mind, calm, dignified, unshaken. "You reminded me who I used to be," he whispered once, replaying his own words. Across the ocean, life in Kyoto went on quietly. Amara continued teaching, her classroom now filled with more students than ever before. Her story had inspired many, especially women who had been underestimated. She had refused every media request. Her peace was her victory. But sometimes, when she locked the classroom at night and walked home alone through the soft glow of lanterns, her thoughts drifted. She remembered the look on Richard's face when he said goodbye. That rare, unguarded look, not of power, but of regret. She wondered if he ever truly changed, or if the city had swallowed him again. One evening, while she was grading papers, her colleague ran into the room, holding a newspaper. "Amara, look." Across the front page was a picture of Richard standing at a press conference. The headline read, "Billionaire Hale launches Global Language Foundation. Words can heal the world." The article said he'd created an organization to provide free language education to marginalized communities around the world, starting with schools in Ghana, Kenya, and the Philippines. When reporters asked why, he'd answered with a quiet smile. "Because the greatest power in the world isn't money. It's understanding." Amara put the paper down slowly. Her hands trembled, but her heart felt strangely warm. That night, she looked out her window toward the stars and whispered, "You really did learn to listen." A year later, fate decided to write its own ending. The Global Language Foundation announced its first international summit, to be held in Tokyo. Educators and linguists from all over the world were invited. Amara didn't plan to go. She wasn't one for crowds or cameras. But when the school's principal nominated her as their representative, she hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The conference hall was magnificent, chandeliers hanging above a sea of guests, each table marked with flags from dozens of countries. Translators whispered into headsets, microphones shimmered, and the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. When the host stepped up to the stage and said, "Please welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Richard Hale," Amara froze. Her heart pounded as he walked onto the stage, tall, confident, but softer now. The man who once mocked others now bowed respectfully before the crowd. He began, "A few years ago, I was the man who believed that success meant being the loudest voice in the room. But one night, I met someone who showed me that true strength often speaks softly, in a language the heart understands." The crowd listened in silence. "She taught me that no matter how many languages you speak, you're still illiterate if you can't speak kindness. And she changed me, not with words, but with grace." Applause filled the hall, but Amara could barely breathe. Her eyes blurred with tears. When the speech ended, Richard stepped down from the stage, greeting people, shaking hands. And then, across the crowd, his gaze found hers. Time froze. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he smiled. Not the practiced billionaire's grin, but something real, something that carried every apology, every memory, every silent word they never got to say. As she walked toward him, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade away. When they finally stood face to face, he said softly, "I wasn't sure you'd come." She smiled faintly. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." He chuckled gently. "Remember you? You changed everything." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the kind that didn't need translation. Then he said quietly, "You know, I finally learned that sentence you taught me in Japanese, the one you said at the restaurant that night." Her brows lifted. "Oh, the one that made everyone stare." He nodded. "Yes, I thought it was just a phrase. But now I know what it really meant." He leaned slightly closer and whispered, his voice trembling just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. "Watashi wa anata karamananda, kokoro no katoba o." I learned from you, the language of the heart. Her lips parted, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. Richard, he smiled gently. No more challenges. No more headlines. Just two people who finally understand each other. She laughed softly through her tears. You never stop surprising me. And you, he said, never stop teaching me. They didn't need to say anything else. The crowd around them kept talking, cameras flashed, people moved, but for them, time stood still. In that moment, there were no billionaire and waitress, no past, and no power. Just two souls who had found their meaning through the languages of pain, humility, and love. Later that night, as the city lights reflected on the water outside the Tokyo Tower, they walked side by side. Amara said quietly, You built something beautiful, Richard. The foundation, it's helping so many. He smiled. It started because of you. You showed me what real value looks like, not in wealth, but in words. She looked up at the glowing skyline and whispered, Maybe some stories don't need endings. He glanced at her. Then maybe this one doesn't end either. And as they walked together through the quiet streets of Tokyo, laughter echoing softly between the neon lights, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Because sometimes, the richest man in the room isn't the one with the money. It's the one who finally learns to listen. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Hit that like button because your one click helps us bring more stories that inspire and heal. Share this video with someone who believes in kindness. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell because the next story might be the one that changes your life forever.